Welcome to the Stubborn Love Podcast. I'm your host, Paige Bond. I'm a Gottman and attachment-trained, solution-focused marriage and family therapist. I specialize in helping folks design and build their dream relationships through structured therapy and resources, and also use modalities that go beyond traditional talk therapy, like accelerated resolution therapy and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. School didn't teach us how to be good at love, so I created the Stubborn Love Podcast to help you navigate it. Every episode has actionable tips that will help you create a happier, healthier, and more fulfilling life with the people you love. Join me on this journey of love and learning for the stuff they didn't teach you in relationship school. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Now let's get ready to rock and roll. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Stubborn Love. I'm your host, Paige Bond, and today we have a very special guest who I actually met at a marriage and family counseling conference. We actually attended each other's sessions, and I thought this guest was so cool that I wanted to invite them on the show and talk a little bit more about this topic. So today we have Dr. Gary Bischoff from Western Michigan University. We're going to be talking today about all the ins and outs about trans relationships. Thank you so much for being here on the show today. I really appreciate it. Can you tell listeners a little bit more about you and your journey of specializing in couples, relationships, and especially trans relationships?
Sure. Glad to be with you, Paige. And yeah, good seeing you again after meeting at the conference. Yes, my name's Dr. Gary Bischoff. I'm a professor at Western Michigan University. Been there for about 25 years. My training is as a couple and family therapist. Have both my degrees from AMFT accredited programs. My master's from Virginia Tech and my doctoral degree from Purdue University. So I originally got into this area looking at couples with a transgender partner after doing some panels in some of my courses and met some various trans individuals who stayed in their relationships through the transition. So they were couples who were together already, and then one of the partners began the process of transitioning and kind of coming to terms with their gender identity. And so I got kind of intrigued with that piece, because originally I thought, wow, this would be kind of a deal breaker, that couples would probably go their separate ways as one came to terms with their gender identity, and that being different than what they originally were. So I got intrigued with this and began doing some research. Part of the research I did was looking at cases from the book Head Over Heels by Virginia Earhart. And that book involves about 30 cases. About half of them were couples who were together. And this was all the wife's perspective. So about half of those cases, so I had a team of students, and we analyzed those cases qualitatively and developed some themes from that. Later, I initiated a study where we did some interviews with couples that fit that profile. Some of the couples got together after the transitioning. A good number of them were together and then, stayed together through the transitioning process. And so we did interviews with them. We had them fill out a survey initially, and then we did an individual interview with each partner, and then we analyzed some of that data and then interviewed the couple together. So that was a nice opportunity to have a couple different points of hearing from them. And so we also have done some analysis on that. So those are a couple of the scholarly pieces I've done, and have been able to publish a couple articles too in one of our Michigan journals called the Michigan Family Review. And it was interesting, the first article that I had published on this area, that was from the Head Over Heels study. It was one of the most downloaded articles in the journal. And so at their 10-year anniversary, they requested folks who had, were authors of the most downloaded ones to do an update. So I had an opportunity to work with some different students, including one trans man as part of our, co-authors. And so we did an update of that. So that was kind of a fun to be invited to do that project.
Yeah.
And after all that, I was on sabbatical a few years ago, and I had been in some administrative roles and then kind of came back to faculty. So I used the sabbatical to launch more into the scholarship and writing in this area. And from that sabbatical, I developed a 1-credit course on transgender couple issues and strengths, and just taught that a couple weeks ago for the third time. I've been teaching that each spring, And the students really appreciate the topic because they don't get a lot of stuff on trans. We're pretty diverse. We emphasize diversity in our department. And, I think we do pretty well focusing on issues related to gay individuals, lesbian individuals, a little bit bisexuality, but not a whole lot with trans. So people have really appreciated a chance to learn more about that. And then particularly, with the focus that I have on looking at the couple relationship. As I got into the literature, really saw that a lot of the early literature was really focused on the trans individual and their developmental sense, their, kind of coming to terms with and transitioning. There really wasn't a whole lot out there on how that transition affects a partner. And so that intrigued me as a couple and family therapist was, really kind of diving into that.
Yeah, and that's what drew me to your presentation so much is that you were focused on the couple relationship. So, whatever partners were involved in that relationship. And I'm actually really curious how the diversity, equity, and inclusion is at university because I don't know how things are for you up there. They sound a lot better than they are here in Florida. They're trying to eradicate anything that has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I was kind of curious how you've seen that develop over time and even how now this is the third time you've taught this course specific to, a couple relationship with one or more partners who has identified as trans. Can you kind of speak to that a little bit?
Sure. One little anecdote when I was getting ready to go to Florida to do the presentation that I did that you saw, my wife was a little concerned. She said, that's not that may not be a very popular topic down there in Florida. I was afraid I might have some woke police come, and protest outside, but nothing like that happened. Fortunately, in Michigan at this time, we have a Democratic governor who's in the second term, and both the House and the Senate had been Republican for a good while. But the last election, those turned Democratic. So it's been interesting to see some of the initiatives that, with a Democratic governor and a Democratic House and Senate. So, for example, one of the pieces of legislation that they passed recently is banning conversion therapy. So, yeah, that was a big effort. And there's been a lot of other ones that have to do with, protecting reproductive rights, protecting rights of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans individuals. So we're at a good spot, I think, right now. And it's interesting. We have a couple. Our dean, our current dean, came from Florida, and then our current interim chair also came from Florida. And both talked about, both are kind of committed to doing diversity work, and we're pleased to be in a different environment where we didn't have the state government trying to police things along those lines. And I would say, we're in Kalamazoo, Michigan, our university is. The western part of Michigan has been populated by people from the Dutch Reformed Church. But Kalamazoo, being a university town, is a little bit more liberal, I would say. And as I mentioned, our department in particular is very committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have a very diverse faculty. We have some openly gay, lesbian faculty members. And so, the department overall is committed to doing scholarship in the area of diversity. So I've never gotten any pushback about, doing this kind of work and nobody questioning the scholarship in the area. It just sort of fits within our mission of, training, culturally competent and diversely competent counselors and counselor educators and counseling psychologists.
Sounds like a really wonderfully affirming environment to be able
Mhm.
to, even if you're part of the marginalized population, you've got support to be working on that social justice initiatives for you. So it
Right.
sounds like a really great environment.
Yeah, it's been a good supportive environment that way. And, faculty members are encouraged to, pursue their interests. We're not a high tier research that, only you can do work that's going to be funded by federal grants and whatnot. So it's been a nice environment that way too, where personal interests, scholarly interests are supported and valued.
Yeah. Now, you said you created the one credit couples course
Mhm.
focused on trans partners because you saw a need for it. You didn't really see that as a big part of the education course system. Can you tell listeners a little bit about what's really missing when counselors are getting educated as far as diversity, and what was so important to you that you were like, "Ugh, I got to create this and I got to start educating more people on this topic?"
Well, as I would do some brief presentations and lectures in my classes, people, students would say, well, we don't get much on trans individuals. So that was some of the impetus. We also have in our curriculum a 1 credit elective, and the chair at that time was supportive of faculty developing some 1 credit courses within our department because a lot of students were taking them outside. So it was a nice opportunity to kind of meet a couple needs, in the curriculum, also a need with a lack of attention to that. I think with trans folks, and students learning about them and the process and all, it has been sort of a lack, and it's been very eye-opening for students. One of the things I have the students do in that 1 credit class, we it's just a weekend workshop format. So prior to that weekend, I have them read a book called Queerly Beloved, and it's the story of a lesbian couple, and then one of the partners transitions to male, and it goes back and forth where one chapter is from one partner, one chapter is from the other partner, and so it's a good inside view of one couple's journey through that transition process. So students have really appreciated reading that and kind of getting into the material. And just this, when I taught it the last time, like, wow, I reading some of the stuff I didn't realize, the impact of hormones, for example, on the body, the skin, the various other kinds of things, and just kind of really seeing it from inside of a couple's view. So that's been a good way to kind of get into the topic, and then we use that case some throughout the weekend as we're applying some of the different concepts and ideas to that.
Yeah, and that's got me wondering, since we think about counselors in training and they're not getting enough of this type of education to be able to help quite a large population out there that really may need our help with whatever issues they may be going through. What do you think most counselors get wrong when it comes to counseling one or more partners who are affected by transitioning, and that they don't have the counselor skills that maybe they should, and it's not
Mhm.
going as well? So what do you think could be helped out there that most counselors are actually not doing right?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges of working with a marginalized group that sometimes people don't have a lot of training on is that the counselors, the therapists are a little over reliant on the clients to help them learn about what it means to be trans, what it means to transition. So that's I think a key piece. So, and that's something I emphasize in the class is that, this is just an introduction to some of these ideas. But if you're going to be working with this population, you need to, kind of keep up with the literature, continue learning about what the kind of struggles there are for various populations. And as we just talked about, those can differ quite a bit depending on what community you're in, what state you're in. We know that, these past couple of years, we've seen a lot of backlash against trans people, against trans youth, with lots of conservative states putting up legislation that restrict rights, that restricts, medical providers from giving care to trans youth, et cetera. So that's one thing I would say. I think sometimes people come into the, working with a trans person and not understand that people transition in a variety of ways. Some might just, it might be about their presentation, their dress. They may not choose initially or even ever to do hormone replacement therapy. Other people do that. Others may do top surgery, but not bottom surgery. So there's quite a bit of variety. So assuming that, okay, somebody's trans, that they're going full blown into all the medical and surgical procedures, to transition is not accurate. Those are a couple things off the top of my head. Some more may come to me in a moment here as you prod me with other questions.
Yeah, thank you for going into that, and I think you're spot on how the counselors can sometimes be reliant on the client to be educating the counselor themselves
Hmm.
rather than the counselor going out and doing what they need to do to become, just more well-versed in working with that population. I see that oftentimes, just being a counselor who specializes in non-monogamy, they'll have people that they've seen, they go to therapists, and the therapists aren't really sure how to really navigate the relationships for them, and they feel
Hmm.
like they're the ones who are teaching their therapist about their lifestyle that may not even actually have anything to do with what they even came into counseling for.
Right, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's another really good point because I think that another assumption that sometimes gets in the way is assuming that they're there because of the trans issues, and that may be a part of that. And if you're working with a couple that's in the midst of that or contemplating that, that is probably a major thing because that's a huge transition that impacts both partners. Um, so yeah, that's a good point that we have to be careful about assuming that as well. As you're talking, I was remembering the case from the book Queerly Below too. Um, one of the things that happens in that book is that the cisgender partner is very supportive of the trans partner and almost sort of takes over. Jesus was kind of the more dominant personality in the relationship and almost kind of took over the transition process. But also had some, other thoughts and feelings that she didn't share with her partner because she didn't want to, dampen the enthusiasm of the transition. So one of the things we talked about in class was, knowing that and seeing that play out in that couple, at those early stages, it's important to make room for a range of feelings and thoughts that both partners may be having, but particularly the cisgender partner, that it's okay to have some misgivings. That's a natural kind of thing. And to create room for that and not assume that means that the cisgender partner is not supportive, but just they're working through it too. One of the things we see often for trans individuals, there's an internal process where they're kind of coming out to themselves, coming to terms with their gender. Now, some people are from very early on very clear that I'm born in the wrong body. There's significant dysphoria and really a strong identity and desire to be other than their natal gender. It's important to know that. Then you might create room for, hey, it's great you're really supportive here. Are there other parts of you that are, having some challenges with this? Some curiosities, wonderings about how this all is going to work out. So that's an important thing to be able to. And the couple in the book, it's interesting. They did not do couple therapy, and so I have the class think some about, if this couple came to couple therapy at different stages of their transitioning and their development, how might that have been different?
Yeah. And, as you say this, I do start to wonder, are there anything in particular else that counselors should know when working with one or more partners who are going through the process of transitioning that maybe they don't really know about or they haven't educated themselves on yet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say one of the things that I talk about in the class that most people are not familiar with are the WPATH standards of care. And that's the World Professionals for Transgender Health. It used to be called the Harry Benjamin Standards of Care, after Harry Benjamin, who was a key physician who kind of coined the term transsexual early on, did a lot of treatment of transsexuals and developed some of the early standards of care. So people aren't familiar with that, and your listeners may or may not be aware that a new version of the PATH standards of care came out just in the last couple of years. They're up to version 8 now. And so that's a good, important resource because part of what counselors get involved in is doing things like being the therapist or the counselor to be able to sign off on and vouch for the person's gender dysphoria so that they might seek treatment. So, for example, in Michigan here, one of the main centers for sexual health is at the University of Michigan, and they require 2 letters from mental health professionals. So that's a little bit more stringent than the WPATH standards currently are. So that's an important area to know about is, what's involved in those letters, what's involved in an assessment, to be able to support the trans person's efforts at transitioning. So that's a whole piece that people generally aren't very familiar with at all, the WPATH standards. And those are important if you're going to work in this area to become familiar with. They're more detailed than they had been in the past. They also created some new chapters this year, separating out children and adolescents. And the citations and the references in that are also very strong.
I did have a question about being either on the client side and trying to seek a therapist that will write a letter. What needs to go into that letter? And are trans folks safe, talking about anything and everything? Like, can anything be used against them in those letters? So I would really like to maybe see if we can look from the client's point of view, what that process looks like.
Yeah. So the WPATH standards are pretty clear about what needs to go in a letter. And a lot of it's fairly straightforward things like, how long has the mental health professional worked with the person? How long, how many sessions? A key part is some information on diagnosis. And again, what they're really looking for there is gender dysphoria and symptoms associated with that. One of the things that, has been in the standards for a long time and why there is some importance of mental health screening and assessment is that they want to assure that the person is not wanting to do this just because of some perceived benefits of being the other gender, but that there's actual gender dysphoria, a clear desire and kind of identity as their other than natal gender. So yeah, the letters, are kind of straightforward, how long they've seen them, what kind of assessments have been done, diagnostic information, those sorts of things. So the person then can take that, at a place where they are required and have that be, supportive of their efforts at transitioning.
Are there ever any times where they're working with a therapist to try to get that letter, yet the therapist may not write it for some reason?
I suppose that could happen, if based on their assessment, the mental health professional is not seeing gender dysphoria or maybe has some, doubts or curiosities about whether, this is, actually appropriate for the person. One of the things that's important to screen out too, as a mental health professional, is are there other, significant mental health issues that are going on? Depression, psychosis, are there other things that are going on that may make it difficult for the person to, consent to and really understand, what all's going on? So that's another piece or one of the reasons maybe, and they might recommend that a person get treatment for that mental health issue before, pursuing transitioning.
Yeah, I suppose that makes sense if someone is under, severe amount of duress or even in a state of psychosis, it could be really hard to actually know what is reality and maybe what internally you're truly seeking. So I guess that makes sense. Kind of
And
switching. Oh, go
go ahead.
ahead.
Well, just because following up on that, another thing that's true, and as you look at the history of trans individuals, they often do have some significant mental health challenges. Substance abuse rates are a little higher, and suicidal ideation is higher. Now, some might look at that and say, "Well, that's because trans people are not well; they're trying to this and that." That's not true, of course, and a key factor why people experience that, like gay and lesbian individuals, is we live in a heterosexist homophobic kind of and anti-trans, especially recently. And so people are struggling with that, their identities and living in a world where they don't seem to fit. That's more the source of stress. So it's societal things, not necessarily something's wrong with them inherently because they identify as transgender. So that's an important thing to be aware of too.
Yeah, I just really wonder what the world could look like for these more marginalized populations and what would happen to the disparity of mental health issues of, someone who is trans versus a straight cisgender like white male
Mhm.
who may not experience so heavy of a mental health issue that someone who is trans or part of the
Right.
LGBTQ community, right? I hope you're enjoying this episode. I want to take a moment to invite you to sign up for my free attachment dynamics workshop. I have partners use this as a foundation before we get started in relationship therapy. By watching this, you'll learn how to recognize negative communication patterns, understand how power dynamics show up in conflict, and most importantly, discover ways to turn conflict into opportunities for deeper emotional connection. And the best part, this is free for you. Make sure to head to pagebond.com or hit the link in the show notes to access it for free. Now let's get back to the episode.
Yes. Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah. And as a family therapist, you have to think about too that coming out to parents can risk relationships. And, one of the things that's important if you work with trans youth is to help them kind of appreciate and understand what are the potential responses by a family. because sometimes they're ostracized from the family. They're kicked out of the family home, and then they're forced to find a place to live. And, that certainly creates some more vulnerability, depending on whether they have a stable and reliable place to stay. Um, so, there could be a lot of challenges involved with, some of the history where families are not supportive.
Yeah. I want to switch gears back to the
Hmm.
couple relationship. And you were able to really study a variety of different types of relationships at different points in time, whether,
Hmm.
the couple got together after someone transitioned, it was during a transition, or even before. So I would really like to maybe see if we can talk about what exactly would you say are the best case scenarios for a couple's relationship surviving? And what are the worst case scenarios where it may be on the fritz or heading towards ending of the
Hmm.
relationship?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's something I talk quite a bit about in the class and some of part of my writings. So I think the ideal situation, so the early phase, there can be discovery where the cisgender partner discovers it and sometimes finds that the other person has been hiding something for a while. So one of the examples from one of the interviews we did was that was a NATO male long distance truck driver and who took female clothes, and the partner found them in the garage in a duffel bag. And so, what's this? So that was more of a discovery kind of thing where felt like there was some deception, as opposed to the transgender partner revealing or disclosing what's been going on. So I think ideally it's better if the trans partner discloses, at some point has that conversation. A lot of times partners are not terribly surprised. They maybe have seen some signs. Sometimes trans folks, drop some clues here and there, drop some hints. So that's an important phase, is how does the cisgender partner find out about it? Is it involved more with discovering and some sense of deception for a while? So that makes, I think, that process more traumatic when that occurs. I think one of the challenges for couples is, for the trans partner, often this is something they've been pursuing, identifying with for a long time, and they're finally feeling like, wow, I can now embody what, I always felt my gender was. And so there's a lot of enthusiasm. They're ready to go for it. And if it's not something that's been discussed or even the cisgender partner's been aware of, how do they get on board with that? So you have one partner, the trans partner, ready to jump into this and ready to go for it, and the cisgender partner kind of, stepping back and saying, whoa, I need to get used to this idea. I don't know if I'm ready to be public as a different looking couple than we are now. So I think that's a key part of the relationship, is being able to honor the trans partner's desire and steps to transition, while also taking into consideration the partner's perspective. And one of the things I think that often is kind of a deal breaker is, ideally, those transitional steps need to be negotiated by the couple. So what is not very helpful, and what probably would lead more towards couples going their separate ways, is unilateral decisions about coming out as trans. So if a person comes out at church, comes out at work, and they haven't, had some agreement with their partner about the timing of that, how they were going to do that, that can lead to a sense of betrayal, kind of lack of trust. The cisgender partner feeling like, I don't have any control. You're just doing this on your own. So that's a key part, I think, that phase. The other thing I would say, it's really important for the trans partner, again, even though they are very excited about, these next steps, is to really appreciate the emotional pieces, the thinking that their partner's doing, and be sensitive to that. So that can be challenging because, hey, I'm ready to do this, but really appreciating, what one's partner is going through. And that may mean, delaying a little bit some of those steps, delaying being out in public about it until both partners, feel like they're ready to do that. And that can be a challenge because, the cisgender partner may be reluctant for longer periods of time than the trans person would like. And so, those are those kind of phases, I think, where couple therapy could be helpful, to help them think through these things, work through them, get an outside perspective. So those are a few things I think that are really important, that can make a difference between whether the couple might stay together or go their separate ways.
Yeah, thank you for touching on each of those. I really appreciate it. And it gets me wondering, it sounds like the main part of this is just making sure you're making decisions like for the relationship as a
Hmm.
whole
Right.
rather than doing what you feel like doing, even though like that's great that you're becoming more authentic to yourself
Hmm.
and you're coming into yourself. There could still be some challenges if you just do what you want rather than talk about it together with your partner.
Hmm. Yes, yes. Yeah, one of the things that sometimes comes up in the literature is that when a cisgender partner might be hesitant, to pursue some of these things because they're, again, the trans person may have done a lot of this internal work, prior to this. And now the cisgender partner has to sort of catch up with some of that. I think it's wrong to assume that the cisgender partner is transphobic when they're hesitant, because sometimes they may get labeled that by other advocates or people in the trans community. But, laying those kind of labels on one's partner is generally not very helpful. And some of that natural hesitancy about adjusting to a major transition, I think, is normal. And we need to normalize that and not assume that that's transphobia. It
Mhm.
could be, it could be transphobic and there could be elements of that. But I think we need to be careful not to label that sort of natural hesitancy sometimes as being transphobic.
Yeah, thank you for touching on that because I think we can easily, get out our pitchforks and start making a muck of things and assuming a story that may not even actually be true. And I
Right.
see this a lot in non monogamous relationships when we change the structure from monogamous to non monogamous,
Hmm.
that people think that the person who's struggling going into non monogamy just isn't approving, just has a bias or whatever. And it's more of that adjustment period. Like
Hmm.
things are different. You're literally changing the structure of the intricacies of your relationship. So I like how you say that just slow your hold before we start throwing labels out and
Hmm.
let's just take a look at what's happening. What's the process going on here? And maybe what support we might be able to identify is needed for that
Hmm.
person who is really
Right.
struggling with that adjustment.
Hmm.
So,
No, I think that's well said. Yeah.
yeah. So what kind of support, for instance, will go along with this scenario for the person who is a bit more hesitant and struggling with the adjustment, what kind of support can we give them, whether it's coming from the counselor or from the trans partner themselves?
Well, I think several things. One is to offer books, first person accounts, and there are a growing number of those out there. One of the books that I've come in contact with recently, there's a workbook for the partners of transgender people. And so I actually was given a copy by our local gay lesbian resource center, and they have been doing more with some trans support groups of partners and spouses of people who are transitioning. So that's a good resource, and that's a relatively recent one, and it has a lot of worksheets in it. It would be a good kind of thing to have as kind of a companion in doing a support group of some kind, where people would kind of do these exercises over time. And there's lots of different topics in there that address, particularly again from the cisgender partner's perspective. Reading books, I think, is a great thing. So the book I mentioned, Queerly Beloved, that workbook also identifies, I haven't seen this book yet, but another book that about a couple who, navigates the transitioning process. There are a lot of good support groups online. Key Flag was a good resource in general for LGBTQ plus supports and for family members and partners. And there are some different conferences that people might go to, things like Southern Comfort or Tri-S. And some of the profiles that I've read are a way for the supportive partner, the non-trans partner, is to go to some of those, just learn about, what it means, what's all this transgender stuff mean, how does it work for couples to stay together, and actually getting to meet other couples who have navigated this. One of the things I hear from couples is working through this and doing it in a good collaborative kind of way can strengthen the relationship because they've had to go through some tough issues and face some things. So they actually can strengthen the relationship. So that's an important thing, to keep in mind as well. So yeah, lots of different supports. I think certainly with the internet and online stuff, more and more stuff, is available.
Yeah. It
And
sounds
linking up with one's local gay and lesbian resource center, that's often a good strategy. So as I mentioned, our local one, just in the last couple years, have developed some more support groups for, again, partners of trans folks.
that's great and a very necessary resource because it can often feel like we're going through this process alone and that maybe no one else understands. So, being able to have that kind of community of other people literally going through the same thing, or maybe already have, and they're just a seasoned person in the group who's giving maybe their insight or good advice. I think that's so impactful. And thank you for speaking on those resources. So, I really
Hmm.
appreciate
Sure.
it. Yeah. Well, is there anything else, speaking either for couples therapists listening to this podcast episode or partners who have a loved one who is transitioning or who is the one transitioning? Is there anything else that you would say to speak to them to be able to strengthen or make the relationship work if they're maybe struggling going through this?
Yeah, I think one area that we haven't touched on that I've included in some of my research and is the impact on the sexual relationship of the couple. And that can be challenging for several reasons. One of the early factors is that the cisgender partner is struggling with, what does this mean that I was with a person who really intended to be a man or a woman and that was different? So their own sexual orientation sometimes may be questioned, and that can be very challenging. You know, I've been straight, I've been attracted to guys. Now my partner is transitioning to female. What does that mean for our sexual relationship? How's that going to go? And so I think that's an area that needs to be addressed too. And there's a wide variety of ways that happens. One of the things to consider is, you know, how does one's natal genitalia play into the current couple sexual relationship? Some trans individuals don't want any contact with anything that's associated with their, previous gender. Other people may be okay with that. One of the things I have seen, particularly from the Head Over Heels book and also some other stuff that I've read, is that for a lot of couples who navigate this, the sexual part of the relationship takes less prominence. Uh, because of some of I think the changes, because of some of the initial attractions, you know, they sometimes don't have sex nearly as much as they used to, and it's just not as it kind of reminds me of a kind of an aging couple that maybe because of illnesses or various things, the sex part is just not as prominent in the relationship. Now that's just for some. I'd say the other thing that is important to consider is the role of hormones on sexual desire, sexual drive, those kind of things. So it's fairly common for people who are taking testosterone to increase their drive. And so what might have been one scenario in a couple where one partner was more the initiator, the testosterone and the, kind of identity as being male might increase that person's drive. And now they're the higher drive partner. So that really changes the relational dynamics around initiating sex, desiring sex. Um, and again, bodies change. Skin thickens, with testosterone. People feel differently. So I think this is an important area for therapists of counselors to be aware of and to be able to broach and talk with a couple about is, how's your sexuality going? How's your physical affection going as part of everything that's happening with all this? And to, again, recognize the importance and the impact of the hormones. I've appreciated more of the nature things, having worked in this area. Being a parent also has helped me appreciate. I was much more of a nurture person before, and still, as a relationship therapist, I still hold that. But I've appreciated having two daughters with very different temperaments kind of coming out of the womb. The role of temperament and personality, and then in this area, really appreciating the role of hormones and how those may change people's styles, personality a little bit, maybe a little bit more argumentative, aggressive when they're, taking testosterone. So I think it's really important to appreciate some of the impact of those medical treatments and hormone replacement therapy.
I really appreciate you going into and highlighting those different dynamics that can show up when we start changing, things either through medical ways or even through just kind of taking inventory of our own sexuality and
Hmm.
making meaning of what this means for our relationship. So thanks for going into all of that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, let me add one other thing on that because this is something I've heard from multiple couples. It is, often couples in this situation, I think, who are effective at staying together kind of shift from, I don't see myself as straight. I don't see myself as gay. I don't want to put myself in a category. My attraction is to my partner. So it becomes more of an individual attraction to that person, not to a class of people necessarily. And so that's the way I think, is an adjustment for the cisgender partner and in part from the transgender partner, kind of making that attraction a more individual thing rather than putting themselves in a class or putting a label on it. So I've heard many people talk about that who have navigated pretty well, the transition process.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that viewpoint on it because I think sexuality can be so unique depending on the person, depending on the attraction to a specific person. And
Hmm.
so I think that that is such a beautiful way of putting it rather
Hmm.
than putting yourself in this box of, oh, well, identify as straight, so I can't, love my partner who
Yeah.
is, So I think a really winning scenario to have that kind of mindset.
Yeah, and that's was probably one of the surprising things. I didn't go into this research thinking that that would be the case, but that is a relatively common way that people describe their kind of changing, sense of attraction and orientation.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for speaking on this very important topic, especially from, having your research background and speaking to the counselor's point of view, but
Mhm.
also speaking for the trans individual or the partner of someone who is transitioning. So I really appreciate all that you've shared with us today. Is there anything else that you would like to let listeners know of, either any resources or any upcoming projects you have going on?
Well, no, I don't think necessarily anything, but I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate you, taking the initiative to say, "Hey, would you mind, doing this podcast?" So, yeah, I appreciate you doing that and the good work you do, looking at consensual non-monogamy, another area that can be kind of complicating, but we see out there quite a bit. So, I was intrigued with your topic, and that's some why I went, and attended your workshop on that too. So, appreciate the good work you're doing in that area as well.
Yeah, I just love when we get, like, 2 fans of each other in the same room or even virtual rooms, so,
Yeah, yeah.
this has been great, and I'm glad you had the time and I got the opportunity to be able to talk with you because I know academia can really be a very busy time for professors and researchers, so I appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. Happy to do it.
All right, listeners. Well, I will make sure to have some links in the show notes about WPATH. I know you mentioned the conferences as well. And so we'll have those links there if anybody wants to check those out, PFLAG resources, things like that. And until next time, thanks so much for listening. And that's a wrap for today's episode of Stubborn Love. I hope you gathered some wisdom to bring into your love life and improve your relationships. If you enjoyed today's chat, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. That'll help this episode reach even more listeners. If you have any questions or stories you would like me to cover in the future episodes, drop me a message. I love hearing from you. If you need extra support in your relationships, check out how we might be able to work together by hopping on my website at pagebond.com. Until next time, don't let being stubborn keep you from secure love. Catch you in the next episode.